There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being unwanted. Margaret Hale knew it well as she stood before a line of men in Black Hollow, each one stepping back when offered her hand. "Too heavy," they whispered, "a widow with nothing to offer." Then Elias Crow, a quiet mountain man who hadn't spoken to the town in years, said 3 simple words: "I'll take her." Folks thought him foolish, a hermit taking on a burden. But hidden in the papers Margaret's late husband left behind was a secret nobody saw coming, a fortune in land and gold that would make Elias the richest man alive. But would his act of kindness survive when greed came calling? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Hale had not always been invisible. There was a time, not so long ago, when she walked through Black Hollow with her head held high, when shopkeepers greeted her by name, when other women invited her to quilting circles and church socials. That was when Samuel was alive. That was when she had a place in the world. Samuel Hale had been a quiet man, methodical and reserved, the kind who measured his words as carefully as he measured timber or calculated freight costs. He worked for the railroad, though Margaret never fully understood the nature of his position. He traveled frequently, sometimes for weeks at a time, returning with dust on his boots and exhaustion in his eyes. But he was always kind to her, always respectful, and in the modest house they shared on the eastern edge of town, they had built a life that was, if not passionate, then at least peaceful. She remembered the day they married. It was 1871, 5 years ago now. She'd been 28, already considered past her prime by the town's harsh standards, and Samuel had been 42, a bachelor who'd spent his youth building railways across the frontier. The ceremony was simple, attended by a handful of Samuel's business associates and a few of Margaret's remaining family members. Her mother had passed 2 years prior, and her father had remarried and moved to California, leaving Margaret in a kind of social limbo. Samuel's proposal had been practical rather than romantic. "I need a wife," he'd said plainly, "someone steady and capable. I believe we'd suit each other well enough." She'd accepted, grateful for the security and the chance to escape the pitying glances of women who whispered about spinsters and missed opportunities. Their marriage had been companionable. Samuel provided well, and Margaret managed their household with quiet efficiency. She learned not to ask too many questions about his work, understanding that some matters were simply beyond her sphere. He kept a study at the back of the house, always locked when he was away, and she respected that boundary. In the evenings, when he was home, they would sit together by the fire. He would read his newspapers and correspondence while she mended or knitted, and sometimes he would share a story from his travels, descriptions of the wild country he'd seen, the camps and railheads and rough settlements that sprang up wherever the tracks went. Black Hollow itself was one such settlement, though by 1876 it had grown into something more substantial. The town sat in a valley where 2 creeks converged, surrounded by pine-covered hills that rose toward the distant mountains. Main Street boasted a general store, a blacksmith, a doctor's office, 2 saloons, a small hotel, and the whitewashed church where Reverend Collins preached each Sunday. The railroad had reached Black Hollow 3 years ago, and with it came an influx of miners, loggers, merchants, and families seeking their fortunes in the territories. The town had swelled to nearly 400 souls, and with that growth came a rigid social structure that Margaret had never quite anticipated. At the top were the town council members and the wealthier merchants, men like Clayton Voss, who represented the railroad's interests, and Judge Morrison, who presided over legal matters with an iron hand. Their wives formed the social elite, hosting tea parties and charity events that determined who was respectable and who was not. Below them were the shopkeepers, the doctor, the reverend, and the more established families. At the bottom were the laborers, the drifters, and the unfortunate, and after Samuel died, Margaret discovered just how quickly one could fall from the middle tier to the very bottom. Samuel's death had come suddenly. One evening in late February, he'd complained of pains in his chest and arms. By morning, he was struggling to breathe, his face grey and clammy. The doctor came, a man named Winters, who Margaret had never particularly liked, and pronounced it a failing heart. There was nothing to be done, Winters said. These things happened, especially to men who worked too hard and carried too much worry. Samuel lasted 2 more days, drifting in and out of consciousness, and then he was gone. The funeral was sparsely attended. Margaret realized, standing beside the grave in the cold March wind, that Samuel had no real friends in Black Hollow, only business associates who paid their respects with perfunctory condolences and quick departures. She'd expected some financial cushion, some savings that would allow her to grieve in peace and decide her future carefully. Instead, she found debts, or rather, what appeared to be debts. The house had a mortgage, the funeral expenses depleted what little cash remained, and there was that trunk, that iron-bound trunk Samuel kept locked in his study, filled with papers she couldn't bring herself to examine. Within a month, the whispers began. A widow alone was a problem in Black Hollow, an irregularity that needed correction. Reverend Collins visited, kind but firm, explaining that it was customary for widows to remarry quickly. It was for her own protection, he said, and for the good of the community. A woman alone invited speculation and instability. He would arrange matters, he assured her. There would be a selection ceremony after the appropriate mourning period. Margaret had been too numb with grief to protest. She moved through those weeks in a fog, barely eating, barely sleeping, haunted by the memory of Samuel's final labored breaths. Her neighbor, Alice Porter, was the only one who showed genuine kindness. Alice brought food, sat with her in the quiet house, and listened when Margaret needed to talk. Alice was younger, perhaps 30, with a warm smile and a practicality born of frontier life. Her husband, John, worked at the lumber mill, and they had 3 young children who sometimes played in Margaret's yard, their laughter a brief respite from the silence. But even Alice couldn't stop what was coming. As the weeks passed and spring arrived, Margaret noticed the change in how people treated her. The shopkeeper's wife, who had once been cordial, now barely acknowledged her. Women crossed the street to avoid conversation. At church, she sat alone in the back pew, feeling the weight of eyes upon her, hearing the whispers that stopped when she turned around. She understood that she was being judged, found wanting, categorized as a burden the town needed to dispose of efficiently. The truth was harder than the whispers. Margaret had always been a large woman, broad-shouldered and heavy-set, and after Samuel's death she'd gained more weight from grief and inactivity. She saw herself in the mirror and understood what others saw: a woman past her prime, plain-faced and heavy, with nothing to recommend her. No beauty, no wealth, no family connections. Just a modest house with a mortgage and a locked trunk full of papers that might as well have been empty for all the good they did her. The selection ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday in mid-May, to be held in the town square after the regular market day. Reverend Collins explained the process with apologetic efficiency. Eligible men would be invited to consider her for marriage. It was all very proper, he assured her, all very respectable. She would be cared for, one way or another. Margaret spent the night before the ceremony going through her meagre wardrobe, trying to find something that would make her look less pathetic. She settled on a black dress, appropriate for her mourning, with a shawl that had been her mother's. The shawl was worn thin in places, but it was the nicest thing she owned, dark wool with a delicate pattern along the edges. She clutched it around her shoulders like armor. That morning, Alice came by with tears in her eyes. "It's not right," she said quietly. "You deserve better than this, Margaret. You deserve to choose for yourself." But choice was a luxury Margaret no longer possessed. She walked to the town square with Alice beside her, feeling the weight of every step, the weight of every eye upon her as the townspeople gathered to watch. This was entertainment for them, she realized, a spectacle, The widow who nobody wanted, paraded before men who would measure her worth and find it insufficient. She barely remembered the men's faces later. There were 5 of them, standing in an awkward line, while Reverend Collins read from a prepared statement about Christian duty and community responsibility. One by one, as her name was spoken and her situation explained, each man stepped back. "Too old," one muttered. "Too plain," another said more quietly. The third simply shook his head. The 4th and 5th didn't even wait for the Reverend to finish before they'd backed away, their expressions mixing discomfort and disdain. Margaret stood there, holding her mother's shawl tighter, feeling the loneliness settle into her bones like winter cold. She was unwanted, completely and utterly unwanted, and everyone in Black Hollow now knew it beyond any doubt. Then she heard a voice from the back of the crowd, rough and deep, speaking 3 words that would change everything. "I'll take her." The crowd parted like water around a stone. Margaret turned toward the voice, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Through the gap in the gathered townspeople, she saw him. Elias Crow was not a man anyone in Black Hollow knew well. He came to town perhaps 4 times a year, always alone, always with furs or game to trade for supplies, and always departing within hours. He lived somewhere up in the high country. That much was common knowledge. But where exactly and how he spent his days remained a mystery that nobody had bothered to solve. Mountain men were a familiar enough sight in the territories, solitary souls who preferred the company of trees and silence to the complications of civilization. He was tall, perhaps 45 years old, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent in sun and wind. His hair was dark brown, shot through with grey, longer than was fashionable, tied back with a leather cord. He wore buckskin trousers and a wool shirt that had seen better days, and his boots were scuffed and worn, but well maintained. There was something solid about him, something that suggested strength without aggression. His eyes, a pale grey blue, held steady as he walked forward through the silent crowd. Margaret found she couldn't speak. The Reverend recovered first, clearing his throat with obvious discomfort. "Mr. Crow, I don't believe you were invited to participate in this proceeding." "Don't recall needing an invitation," Elias said quietly. His voice was calm, matter of fact. "You're offering the lady for marriage?" "I'm accepting." A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Margaret saw shock on some faces, amusement on others, and on a few, something that looked almost like disappointment, as though they'd been hoping for a different kind of spectacle. Judge Morrison, standing near the front with his wife, stepped forward with a frown. "This is highly irregular, Crow. We don't know anything about your circumstances. Do you have the means to provide for a wife?" Elias turned his pale eyes on the judge. "I have a home, land, and enough to live on. More than some." He didn't elaborate, and something in his tone suggested he wouldn't, no matter how much they pressed. Reverend Collins looked between Margaret and Elias, clearly uncertain how to proceed. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. The selected men were known quantities, town residents or nearby farmers who could be vouched for by other respectable citizens. Elias Crow was an unknown, a man who lived on the edges of their world and followed his own path. "Mrs. Hale," the Reverend said finally, turning to Margaret, "do you consent to this arrangement?" Margaret met Elias Crow's eyes for the first time. She expected to see pity there, or perhaps the smug satisfaction of a man taking advantage of a desperate situation. Instead, she saw something quieter and more complex, a kind of recognition, as though he understood exactly what this moment meant and chose to stand in it anyway. There was no mockery in his gaze, no calculation, just a simple, straightforward steadiness. "Yes," she heard herself say. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I consent." Judge Morrison shook his head. "This is foolishness, Collins. We should postpone until proper inquiries can be made." But Reverend Collins, whatever his faults, understood the situation Margaret faced. If they sent her home now, unmarried and publicly rejected by every suitable man, her position would become impossible. At least this way, she would have the protection of a husband's name, however unconventional the circumstances. "The lady has consented," Collins said firmly. "Let's proceed with the ceremony." What followed happened so quickly that Margaret barely had time to process it. The Reverend recited the familiar words, abbreviated and rushed, clearly wanting to conclude this awkward business as efficiently as possible. Elias stood beside her, close enough that she could smell the pine and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. When asked to speak his vows, he did so in that same quiet, steady voice. When it was her turn, Margaret's voice trembled, but she got through the words. Then came the paperwork. Reverend Collins produced several documents from his leather satchel, spreading them on a small table someone had hastily brought forward. "Standard marriage contract," he explained, indicating where they should sign. "And these are the property transfer documents. Since you're inheriting Mrs. Hale's estate, such as it is, these will need your signature as well, Mr. Crow." Margaret felt a flicker of surprise. She hadn't known there would be property transfers. But then, she'd been too grief-stricken and exhausted to pay much attention to the details Collins had mentioned during his visits. Elias took the pen without hesitation. He signed where indicated, his hand steady, and his signature surprisingly neat for a man who lived in the wilderness. Margaret signed as well, though her hand shook slightly. She noticed that Judge Morrison witnessed the signatures, along with a severe-looking man in a dark suit, whom she recognized as one of the railroad officials. The man watched Elias with an expression that might have been irritation or might have been something else entirely. When the papers were folded and put away, Reverend Collins pronounced them man and wife. There was no kiss, no celebration, no shower of rice or good wishes. The crowd began to disperse almost immediately, conversation rising in excited murmurs. Margaret heard snippets as people passed. "Mountain man. Can you imagine? Probably take her to some cabin in the wilderness. Charitable of him, I suppose." In a strange way, Alice Porter pushed through the thinning crowd and embraced Margaret tightly. "Oh, Margaret," she whispered, "I hope this brings you some measure of peace. And you, Mr. Crow." She turned to Elias, her expression fierce. "You be good to her, you hear? She's been through enough." Elias nodded solemnly. "Yes, ma'am, I intend to." John Porter appeared behind his wife, a stocky man with kind eyes. He extended his hand to Elias. "You'll need help moving her things, I expect. I can bring a wagon round if you'd like." "I'd appreciate that," Elias said. "Much obliged." The practicalities happened quickly after that. Margaret walked back to her house in a daze, accompanied by Alice, while the men handled the arrangements. Inside the small parlor, surrounded by the furniture and belongings that represented 5 years of marriage to Samuel, Margaret felt the full weight of what had just occurred settle onto her shoulders. "I don't even know him," she said quietly. Alice was helping her pack a trunk with clothes and necessities. "I don't know anything about him." "Do you think you're in danger from him?" Alice asked, her hands stilling on the folded linens. Margaret considered this. The truth was, she didn't feel afraid of Elias Crow. She felt uncertain, yes, and overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. But afraid? No. There had been something fundamentally decent in his eyes, something that suggested he wouldn't harm her. "No," she said finally. "No, I don't think so." "Then maybe this is a blessing in disguise," Alice said gently. "Maybe this is your chance to start over, away from all these people who treated you so poorly." Margaret pulled Samuel's locked trunk from the corner of the study. It was heavy, iron-bound and sturdy, and she'd been unable to bring herself to open it since his death. Now she wondered if she should leave it behind, let go of whatever papers and memories it contained. But something made her hesitate. "I need to bring this," she told Alice. "Samuel kept important documents in. I should at least know what they are." When the wagon arrived, John and Elias loaded the trunk along with her other belongings, 2 more trunks of clothes and household items, a few pieces of furniture Samuel had made, some books, and the worn quilt from her marriage bed. It wasn't much to show for 33 years of life, but it was all she had. The mortgage holder, a banker named Prescott, who served on the town council, appeared as they were finishing. He had papers for Elias to sign, transferring the debt along with the property. Margaret noticed that Prescott seemed disappointed about something, though he tried to hide it behind professional courtesy. He kept glancing at the iron-bound trunk with an odd expression. "That trunk there," Prescott said carefully. "That belonged to Samuel Hale?" "It did," Margaret said, suddenly protective. "It's mine now." Prescott nodded slowly. "Of course. Just making sure everything's accounted for properly. Mr. Crow, you understand. You're assuming all debts and assets associated with the former marriage?" "I understand," Elias said. After Prescott left, Elias helped Margaret onto the wagon seat beside him. The afternoon sun was already dropping toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Alice hugged Margaret one more time, making her promise to visit or at least send word that she was all right. Then Elias clicked to the horses, and they began moving through town toward the mountain road. Margaret looked back once, seeing the whitewashed church and the familiar buildings of Black Hollow receding behind them. She was leaving behind the only home she'd known for 5 years, leaving behind her grief and her memories and her humiliation, following a stranger into the wilderness. Beside her, Elias sat silent and steady, handling the reins with practiced ease. After a long while, he spoke without looking at her. "I have a cabin about 3 hours up into the high country. It's simple, but sound. You'll have your own space, and I'll respect your privacy. I'm not expecting anything from you, beyond what you're willing to give. I want you to know that." Margaret felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Why did you accept me when no one else would?" Elias was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because I know what it's like to be unwanted, and because it seemed to me like you deserved better than what those people were offering you." It was the simplest answer possible, and somehow the most profound. Margaret clutched her mother's shawl around her shoulders and watched the mountain road unfold before them, carrying her toward an uncertain future that was, at least for the first time in months, her own. The journey to Copper Ridge took them through country that grew progressively more settled as they descended from the high mountains. They traveled with caution, Elias keeping the rifle within easy reach and choosing campsites that offered good visibility and defensible positions. Margaret noticed how he studied every rider they passed, how his eyes constantly scanned the tree line, and she understood that his years as a soldier had taught him vigilance that never quite faded. On the second night, camped beside a creek where cottonwoods offered some shelter, they sat by the fire after supper and talked in ways they hadn't before. The darkness and the isolation seemed to make honesty easier. "Tell me about your marriage," Elias said. "To Samuel. If you don't mind talking about it." Margaret considered the question, warming her hands on a cup of coffee. "It was comfortable, respectful. He was kind to me, never cruel or demanding. But I don't think either of us married for love. He wanted a capable wife who wouldn't interfere with his work. I wanted security and a place in the world. Did you love him? I cared for him. I mourned him when he died. But love," she shook her head slowly. "I think we both understood what we were to each other, companions more than lovers. There are worse things than a practical marriage." Elias nodded, staring into the fire. "My wife died in the war. Cholera swept through our county while I was away fighting. By the time I got the news and made it home, she'd been in the ground 3 months. His voice was matter-of-fact, but Margaret heard the old pain beneath it. Her name was Catherine. We'd been married 2 years, barely knew each other really. I was young and foolish, and she was the prettiest girl in town. We thought that was enough. I'm sorry, Margaret said softly. Long time ago now. He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. After I buried her, I couldn't stay in that town. Too many memories, too many people who wanted me to be someone I wasn't anymore. The war changes a man, and not always for the better. I came west, looking for empty country where nobody would ask questions. Why did you come to town that day? Margaret asked. The day of the ceremony. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, I needed supplies and figured I'd get in and out before the church crowd dispersed. But I heard the commotion in the square, and curiosity got the better of me. I saw you standing there, saw those men backing away one by one, and I saw the look on your face. He glanced at her. You weren't just humiliated, you were resigned to it, like you'd already accepted that this was all you deserved. It reminded me of how I felt after Catherine died, like I was just going through motions until the end came. So you took pity on me? No. His voice was firm. Pity would have been walking away and letting you suffer. What I felt was recognition. I saw someone who'd been beaten down by life but was still standing. That takes strength, Margaret. More than people realize. She felt something warm bloom in her chest, something she couldn't quite name. Thank you for that day. Whatever happens with all of this, she gestured to the saddlebags containing Samuel's documents. I'm grateful you were there. We'll figure it out together, Elias said simply. They reached Copper Ridge on the afternoon of the fourth day. It was larger than Black Hollow, with brick buildings along Main Street and obvious signs of prosperity driven by mining and ranching. Elias guided the wagon to a modest hotel where they took separate rooms and cleaned off the trail dust before seeking out Harrison Webb's office. The attorney's practice occupied the second floor of a building near the courthouse. A neat sign on the door read, Harrison Webb, Attorney at Law, Land and Property Matters. Inside, a clerk directed them to wait in a spare but well-appointed office. Webb himself appeared a few minutes later, a man in his 50s with steel-grey hair and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He stopped short when he saw Margaret, recognition dawning on his face. Mrs. Hale, he said, then corrected himself. Mrs. Crow, I should say. I heard about your remarriage. He turned to Elias, extending his hand. Harrison Webb, your timing is fortunate. I've been trying to locate Mrs. Hale for several weeks now. Why? Margaret asked as they all sat down. Webb folded his hands on his desk, his expression serious. Because Samuel Hale was my client, and because I believe his death was not from natural causes. I've been conducting a quiet investigation, and I've uncovered some disturbing irregularities. Margaret's breath caught. Elias leaned forward. What kind of irregularities? Let me start at the beginning. Webb opened a drawer and removed a file. Samuel hired me 5 years ago to handle his land acquisitions and to provide legal protection for his transactions. He was one of the most meticulous clients I've ever worked with. Everything documented, everything above board. He had a gift for identifying valuable properties before their value was apparent to others. We found his records, Margaret said. The deeds, the contracts, the stock certificates. Webb's eyebrows rose. You opened the trunk. Good. Then you understand what Samuel built. What you might not understand is how valuable those holdings have become. The Continental and Pacific Railroad is planning a major expansion through this territory. The properties Samuel acquired are now the key to that expansion. We're talking about millions of dollars in potential value. Margaret felt dizzy. Millions? The land alone is worth a substantial sum. The stock certificates add considerably more. And the strategic position of the parcels gives you leverage that's difficult to quantify. Webb paused. Which is why there are powerful interests who want to take it from you. Clayton Voss, Elias said. Webb looked surprised. You know about Voss? We know he's connected to the railroad. We know he approached us. offering to buy the properties. We know Samuel was threatened before his death. Voss is the regional vice president of Continental and Pacific. He's been trying to acquire Samuel's holdings for 2 years. Samuel refused every offer, no matter how generous, because he understood what they were really worth. Webb removed a document from his file. 3 months before Samuel died, Voss made a final offer. Samuel not only refused, but threatened to go public with evidence of fraud in the railroad's land acquisition practices. Margaret leaned forward. What kind of fraud? The railroad has been using intermediaries to buy land at artificially low prices by hiding their true identity and intentions. They've intimidated landowners, falsified surveys, and in at least one case, arranged for a property owner to face criminal charges on manufactured evidence, forcing a sale to cover legal costs. Samuel documented all of it. He told me he planned to present the evidence to territorial authorities if Voss continued pressuring him. And then Samuel died, Margaret said quietly. Yes, the official cause was heart failure, certified by Dr. Winters in Black Hollow. Webb pulled out another document, but I had my investigator look into Dr. Winters. He left town the day before Samuel fell ill. The signature on the death certificate is forged. The room seemed to tilt. Margaret gripped the arms of her chair. Someone killed him. I believe so. And I believe it was made to look natural, so there would be no investigation, no questions asked. A middle-aged man working too hard, stress taking its toll. The story writes itself. Webb's expression was grim. I've been trying to gather evidence sufficient to reopen the case, but it's delicate. Voss has connections to Judge Morrison and several members of the town council in Black Hollow. Any formal accusation would alert them before I could build a solid case. Elias spoke carefully. So what do we do? Legal position first. As Margaret's husband, you're now the rightful owner of all Samuel's properties and assets. I'll file the proper documents here in Copper Ridge, where the land office isn't compromised. We'll also need to transfer the stock certificates into your names formally and get them secured in a bank vault. Webb looked at Margaret. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Crow, and I'm sorry to burden you with this knowledge, but you need to understand what you're up against. Margaret straightened in her chair, feeling that same sense of purpose that had come over her in the mountain cabin. What I understand is that my husband worked his entire adult life building something of value, and someone murdered him for it. I won't let them win. I won't let his death be for nothing. Webb spent the next 2 days conducting a thorough review of Samuel's documents. He worked methodically, creating an inventory of every deed, every contract, every stock certificate. Margaret and Elias stayed at the hotel, venturing out only for meals, following Webb's advice to keep a low profile. On the second afternoon, Webb summoned them back to his office. His desk was covered with papers, organized into neat stacks, and his expression carried a mixture of satisfaction and concern. I've completed the assessment, he said, gesturing for them to sit. The total value of your holdings is even greater than I initially estimated. You own outright 23 parcels of land, totaling just over 4,000 acres. 12 of those parcels lie directly along the planned railroad expansion route. 3 parcels contain proven mineral deposits. He pulled out a professional document with official seals. This is an assay report, dated 3 months before Samuel's death. It confirms significant gold deposits on 3 properties in the Northern Territory. Not enough to rival the big strikes in California, but substantial nonetheless. Easily worth $250,000 if developed properly. Margaret's hands trembled as she took the report. The numbers swam before her eyes. Samuel never told me. He was protecting you, Webb said gently. The less you knew, the safer you were. Or so he believed. Unfortunately, his death created a different kind of danger. He turned to Elias. The question now is what you want to do. You have several options. You could sell everything to Voss's company and walk away wealthy. You could develop the properties yourself, though that would require significant capital and expertise. Or you could hold the land and negotiate from a position of strength, forcing the railroad to deal fairly. What did Samuel want? Elias asked. Webb smiled slightly. Samuel believed that the railroad expansion would benefit everyone if done honestly. He wanted fair compensation for landowners, jobs for local workers, and development that didn't destroy communities. He despised the way men like Voss operated, buying cheap through deception, displacing families, corrupting officials. He saw his holdings as a way to force them to do better. "Then that's what we'll do," Margaret said firmly. "We'll honor Samuel's intentions. That means rejecting any offers from Voss, no matter how attractive," Webb warned. "It means standing firm even when pressured, and it means accepting that you're making powerful enemies." Elias met Margaret's eyes, and she saw in them a question. This was her inheritance, Samuel's legacy. The choice should be hers. She thought about the man who'd married her out of practicality, who'd worked quietly for years building something meaningful, who'd protected her even in death by keeping her ignorant of the danger. She owed him this. She owed him justice. "We're keeping it," she said, "all of it, and we're going to make sure Samuel's killers answer for what they did." Webb nodded approvingly. "Then we have work to do. I'll file the transfer documents with the Territorial Land Office here in Copper Ridge. Everything will be properly recorded and legally unassailable. I'll also arrange for the stock certificates to be placed in secure storage at the Territorial Bank. And I'll continue investigating Samuel's death, building a case we can eventually present to an honest judge." "What about Voss?" Elias asked. "He'll find out soon enough that we're not selling. Let him. By the time he learns the transfers are complete, it will be too late for legal maneuvering. He'll have to deal with you directly, and he'll have to do it honestly, or risk exposure." Webb's expression hardened. "I've been documenting the railroad's corrupt practices for months. If Voss pushes too hard, we can make his life very difficult." That evening, Margaret and Elias walked through Copper Ridge as sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. The town was bustling with miners and ranchers, with families shopping at stores and children playing in the streets. It felt alive in a way Black Hollow never had. And Margaret realized she was seeing the future Samuel had envisioned, prosperity built on honest work rather than exploitation. "Are you frightened?" Elias asked, as they paused near the edge of town, looking out at the mountains in the distance. "Yes," Margaret admitted, "but I'm also angry. Samuel was a good man who worked hard for everything he built. Someone took his life for their own greed. That's not something I can just accept and walk away from." "You've changed since that day in the town square," Elias observed. "So have you. You came down from the mountain for supplies and ended up with a wife and a fortune you didn't ask for." He smiled slightly, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Strange how life works out. I spent 20 years avoiding complications, and then I walked into the biggest complication imaginable. Do you regret it?" "No." His answer was immediate and honest. "I don't regret it at all." They stood in comfortable silence as darkness gathered. Margaret thought about everything that had changed in such a short time. She'd gone from being a rejected widow with nothing to lose to a woman fighting to protect a legacy worth millions. She'd gone from being alone and hopeless to standing beside a man who chose to fight with her rather than walk away. "Elias," she said softly, "when this is over, when we've secured everything and dealt with Voss and gotten justice for Samuel, what then? What do we do with all of it?" He considered the question carefully. "I think we do what Samuel would have wanted. We develop it responsibly. We create opportunities for honest people. We prove that wealth doesn't have to come from corruption." He looked at her. "And maybe we build something of our own. Something that matters." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. For so long she'd felt invisible, worthless, a burden no one wanted. Now she saw possibility stretching before her, bright and real. "I'd like that," she said. The next morning, Webb had news. Clayton Voss is in town. He arrived last night on the evening train. My clerk saw him check into the Grand Hotel with 2 other men. He knows we're here, Elias said. Almost certainly. Which means he'll be coming with an offer soon, and when you refuse him, things will likely escalate. Webb handed Elias a card. This is Marshal Roy Hendricks. He's one of the few territorial lawmen I trust completely. I've sent him a message explaining the situation. If you need help, he can be here within 2 days. That afternoon, as Margaret and Elias were preparing to leave Webb's office, a boy delivered a message. It was written on expensive hotel stationery in elegant script. Mr. and Mrs. Crow, I would be pleased to meet with you regarding a business matter of mutual interest. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, the Grand Hotel dining room. I believe we can reach an arrangement that benefits everyone involved. Respectfully, Clayton Voss. Margaret read it twice, then handed it to Elias. Do we go? We go, Elias said, but we go prepared. And we make it clear that Samuel's legacy isn't for sale. The Grand Hotel's dining room was elegant in the frontier style, with dark wood paneling and white tablecloths. Clayton Voss sat at a corner table, a cup of coffee before him, dressed in an expensive suit that marked him as a man of means and influence. He stood as Margaret and Elias approached, his smile practiced and welcoming. Mrs. Crow, Mr. Crow, thank you for accepting my invitation. He gestured to the chairs across from him. Please sit. Would you care for coffee? Breakfast? Just coffee, Elias said, his tone neutral. Voss signaled a waiter, then settled back in his chair, studying them both with the assessing gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating opponents. He was perhaps 50, with greying temples and features that might have been handsome if not for the calculating coldness in his eyes. I'll be direct, Voss said once. The coffee was poured. I know you've been to see Harrison Webb. I know you've reviewed Samuel Hale's documents. And I know you now understand the value of what you've inherited. He paused. I'm prepared to make you a generous offer. $800,000 for all properties and stock holdings. Cash payment within 30 days. You'd be wealthy people, free to go anywhere and live however you choose. Margaret felt the weight of the number. $800,000. It was more money than she could have imagined a month ago, more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. That's less than a third of what it's actually worth, Elias said calmly. Voss's smile tightened slightly. The appraised value and the real value are often different things, Mr. Crow. Yes, on paper those holdings might be worth more, but value means nothing if you can't realize it. Development takes capital, expertise, connections. The railroad has all of those things. You have land and paper, certificates. We also have options, Margaret said. We can develop the properties ourselves. We can negotiate with other railroad companies. We can hold the land and watch its value increase as the territories develop. All theoretical, Voss leaned forward. Let me be frank. Samuel Hale was a brilliant man, but he made the mistake of overplaying his hand. He thought he could leverage his holdings to dictate terms to the Continental and Pacific. That kind of thinking is dangerous, especially when you're dealing with organizations that have significant resources and long memories. The threat was barely veiled. Elias's expression didn't change. Are you threatening us, Mr. Voss? I'm offering you a realistic assessment of your position. Voss's tone remained pleasant, but Steele underlaid his words. You're mountain people, not businessmen. You've inherited something you don't fully understand and can't properly manage. Take the money. Go live your lives. Don't make Samuel's mistakes. Margaret felt anger rising in her chest. What mistakes would those be? Building something of value through honest work? Refusing to be bullied by men who think power gives them the right to take whatever they want? Voss's smile disappeared entirely. Samuel Hale's stubbornness cost him everything, Mrs. Crow. I'd hate to see you and your husband suffer the same fate. Elias stood, his movement controlled but purposeful. This meeting is over. We're not selling, not at any price. Samuel's holdings are not for sale. You're making a serious error in judgment, Voss said, remaining seated. I'm trying to help you avoid the complications that come with refusing reasonable offers. Your offer isn't reasonable, and your threats don't frighten us, Margaret said, standing beside Elias. We know what Samuel built, and we know what it's worth, and we know what happened to him when he wouldn't yield to pressure. Something flickered in Voss's eyes. Careful what accusations you make, Mrs. Crow. Samuel Hale died of heart failure. That's a matter of medical record. A record signed by a doctor who wasn't even in town when Samuel died, Elias said quietly. A forged signature on a death certificate. That's not just suspicious, Mr. Voss. That's evidence of a crime. For the first time, Voss looked genuinely surprised. Then his expression hardened. You have no idea what you're dealing with. The Continental and Pacific Railroad employs thousands of people. It has contracts with territorial and federal authorities. It has resources you can't begin to match. If you insist on this path, you'll find yourselves facing legal challenges, property disputes, and complications at every turn. Then we'll face them, Margaret said firmly, with good legal counsel and honest authorities on our side. Harrison Webb isn't the only person who knows about your company's corrupt practices, Mr. Voss. And Judge Morrison isn't the only judge in the territories. Voss stood, slowly, straightening his jacket. This conversation is over, but understand this: you've made your choice, and you'll have to live with the consequences. The railroad will have those properties one way or another. You can profit from that reality, or you can be crushed by it. The choice is yours. He walked away without waiting for a response. Margaret felt her legs trembling, but forced herself to remain standing until Voss had left the dining room. Then she sank back into her chair, exhaling shakily. That was terrifying, she admitted. You handled it perfectly, Elias said, his hand covering hers on the table. He expected us to fold. We didn't. They returned to Webb's office and recounted the meeting. The attorney listened carefully, making notes. When they finished, he sat back with a troubled expression. Voss showed his hand more than he intended. That comment about Samuel dying when he refused to yield, that was careless. It confirms our suspicions. He stood and moved to a locked cabinet, removing a folder. I received this from my investigator yesterday. I was going to wait to share it, but after this morning, you need to see it now. He spread several documents on his desk. This is the forged death certificate. Note the signature, supposedly Dr. Winters. And this is a bank record showing that Dr. Winters received a payment of $500 2 days before Samuel's death, transferred from an account registered to a company called Mountain Territory Holdings. I don't recognize that name, Margaret said. It's a shell company, created specifically to hide the real owners. But my investigator traced it back through 3 layers of intermediaries. Webb pulled out another document. Mountain Territory Holdings is wholly owned by the Continental and Pacific Railroad. The payment to Dr. Winters came directly from Voss's operation. Margaret felt the room spin. Attention, or worse. Webb's expression was grim. My investigator spoke to Samuel's housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Chen who worked for Samuel occasionally. She remembered a visitor who came to the house 2 days before Samuel fell ill. Well-dressed man, very polite, said he was from a mining company interested in discussing opportunities. He brought a gift, a bottle of expensive whiskey. Mrs. Chen remembered because Samuel rarely drank, but this man was so insistent that Samuel accepted it to be polite. The implications crashed over Margaret like a wave. Poison, possibly. Certain substances can mimic heart failure symptoms if administered carefully, and without a proper autopsy, which never happened, there would be no way to prove foul play. Webb met her eyes. I can't prove this in court yet. The evidence is circumstantial. But I believe Samuel was murdered, and I believe Clayton Voss either ordered it or knew about it. Elias stood and moved to the window, his hands clenched at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was hard in a way Margaret had never heard before. "How do we prove it? We need the whiskey bottle, if it still exists. We need testimony from someone who can connect Voss directly to the plot, and we need to find the man who delivered the poisoned whiskey." Webb paused. "My investigator is working on all of this, but it takes time. Meanwhile, we need to keep you both safe." "Safe from what?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "From the same people who killed Samuel. You're now the obstacle to what they want, and you've just publicly refused their offer and accused them of crimes. That makes you a threat they'll want to eliminate." The weight of their situation settled fully onto Margaret's shoulders. She'd known intellectually that they were in danger, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real in a way nothing else had. Someone had killed Samuel. Someone who viewed human lives as obstacles to be removed when convenient. And now she and Elias stood in that same position. "There's something else," Webb said quietly. "Something I learned just this morning that changes everything." He pulled out a final document. "Samuel had a brother, Thomas Hale. Did you know about him?" Margaret shook her head. "Samuel never mentioned family. I assumed he had none. Thomas Hale lives in San Francisco. He's a businessman with his own connections to railroad interests. And here's where it gets complicated under territorial law. If a widow remarries quickly after her husband's death, the deceased's family can sometimes contest property transfers, especially if they can prove the remarriage was coerced or arranged under duress." "Is that what they're planning?" Elias asked. "My sources indicate that Thomas Hale is on his way to Copper Ridge right now. He's been in contact with Clayton Voss, and he's prepared to file a legal challenge claiming that Margaret's remarriage was improperly rushed and that as Samuel's only blood relative, he has rightful claim to a substantial portion of the estate." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. "So even if we fight off Voss, Samuel's own brother is going to try to take everything?" "It appears so. Family betrayal motivated by greed." Webb's expression was sympathetic. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Crow. This is going to get uglier before it gets better." Elias returned to the table and sat beside Margaret, his presence solid and reassuring. "Then we prepare for ugly. We gather evidence, we build our legal case, and we don't back down. Samuel worked too hard for too long to let these people win." Margaret looked at the documents spread across Webb's desk, the forged death certificate, the suspicious payments, the evidence of conspiracy and murder. She thought about Samuel, working quietly for years, building something valuable through patient, honest effort. She thought about how he'd protected her even in death, though that protection had ultimately put her in even greater danger. And she thought about Elias, who'd stood in a town square and chosen her when no one else would, who now stood with her against threats neither of them had anticipated. "We fight," she said firmly. "We fight for Samuel's legacy, for justice, and for the right to keep what's ours. And we don't stop until we win." Harrison Webb moved quickly after the meeting with Voss. By afternoon, he'd sent urgent telegrams to Marshal Roy Hendricks and had arranged for additional security at his office. He insisted that Margaret and Elias move into a boarding house owned by his sister-in-law, a stern woman named Mrs. Kaufman, who kept a shotgun behind the front desk and asked no questions about the nature of her guests' business. "The Grand Hotel has too many eyes and ears," Webb explained. "Mrs. Kaufman is discreet, and her house has good sightlines. Anyone approaching will be visible from several windows." That evening, Webb's investigator arrived, with news. His name was Daniel Price, a former Pinkerton agent who'd settled in Copper Ridge after years of tracking criminals across the territories. He was in his 40s, compact and weathered, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Found the housekeeper, Mrs. Chen," Price reported, spreading his notes on Webb's desk. "She's frightened, but willing to testify if we can guarantee her safety. She remembers the visitor, clearly mid-40s, expensive clothes, carried himself like someone important. She didn't get a name, but she'd recognize him. And she still has the whiskey bottle. Never opened it. Samuel took one drink the evening after the man left and complained it tasted off, so he set it aside. Webb looked up sharply. The bottle still exists? Mrs. Chen kept it. Said Samuel was particular about waste and would have wanted it given to someone who'd appreciate it, but she never got around to it. After he died, she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. It's been in her pantry for 6 months. Price pulled out a wrapped package. I convinced her to let me take it, told her it might be important. This could be everything we need, Webb said, handling the package carefully. If we can test the contents and find poison, and if Mrs. Chen can identify the man who brought it, we can build a case for murder. There's a chemist in Denver who handles this kind of analysis, Price said. Former army surgeon. He's tested substances in criminal cases before. I can take the bottle to him, but it'll take a week at minimum. Do it, Webb said. Use whatever resources you need. This is the evidence that could break the whole conspiracy open. Over the next 3 days, the situation intensified. Thomas Hale arrived in Copper Ridge and immediately filed legal documents challenging the property transfers. He claimed that Margaret had been coerced into a hasty remarriage by unscrupulous parties who sought to steal his brother's legacy. He demanded an injunction, freezing all assets until the matter could be properly adjudicated. Webb countered with documents proving that the marriage was legal and proper, that all transfers had been executed according to territorial law, and that Thomas Hale had shown no interest in his brother's affairs until after Samuel's death. He also filed a motion questioning Thomas's standing, noting that Samuel had deliberately excluded his brother from his will and had no contact with him for over a decade. The legal maneuvering attracted attention throughout Copper Ridge. The local newspaper ran articles about the dispute, though they framed it as a routine inheritance matter rather than the conspiracy it truly was. Townspeople took sides, some sympathizing with the mountain man and his wife, others viewing them as interlopers, trying to claim wealth they hadn't earned. Meanwhile, Marshal Roy Hendricks arrived from the territorial capital. He was a tall man in his 50s, with a weathered face and eyes that held the authority of someone who'd spent decades enforcing law on the frontier. He listened to Webb's presentation of evidence, asked pointed questions, and then turned his attention to Margaret and Elias. "This is a serious matter," he said plainly. "Murder, conspiracy, corruption. If we can prove even half of what Mr. Webb suspects, there'll be arrests and trials, but that takes time, and time is something you might not have. These people have already killed once. They won't hesitate to do it again if they feel cornered." "What do you suggest?" Elias asked. "We prepare for the worst while we gather evidence. I'll deputize you and anyone else we can trust. We'll establish a defensive perimeter and make sure you're not vulnerable to attack. And we'll move fast once Price returns with the test results." Hendricks paused. "But you need to understand that even if we prove Samuel was murdered, that doesn't necessarily resolve the property dispute. Thomas Hale's legal challenge is separate from the criminal case. So we could prove Voss killed Samuel and still lose everything to Samuel's brother?" Margaret asked. "It's possible. The law doesn't always deliver the justice we'd like." Hendricks's expression was sympathetic but realistic. "That's why it's important to fight on both fronts, legal and criminal. Win both cases, and Samuel's legacy is protected." Alice Porter arrived unexpectedly on the 4th day, accompanied by her husband John and Reverend Collins. Margaret was shocked to see them standing in the parlor of Mrs. Kaufman's boarding house, travel-worn but determined. "We heard what was happening," Alice said, embracing Margaret tightly. "The whole town knows about Thomas Hale's challenge. Some folks are saying terrible things, but others remember how Samuel was treated and how you were treated after he died. We wanted you to know you're not alone." Reverend Collins looked uncomfortable but resolute. "I need to make a confession, Mrs. Crow. I was pressured to rush your remarriage. Judge Morrison and Mr. Prescott at the bank told me it was necessary, that there were financial complications. I didn't ask questions like I should have. I'm deeply sorry." "Who pressured you?" Webb asked sharply. Clayton Voss met with Morrison and Prescott 2 weeks before the ceremony. I overheard part of their conversation through the judge's office door. Voss said something about making sure the widow was dealt with quickly and that the right kind of husband would make things simpler. Collins met Margaret's eyes. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I thought it was just business talk. But now I see they were trying to manipulate the situation to their advantage. They wanted me to marry someone they could control, Margaret said slowly, someone pliable or corrupt. If I'd married one of those 5 men who were selected, Voss would have had access to Samuel's papers through my husband. But Elias stepped in, Alice said, and he wasn't someone they could predict or control. John Porter nodded. We also heard something else you should know. There are men in Black Hollow asking questions about where you went. Rough-looking types, not locals. They're offering money for information about the mountain cabin. Elias and Hendricks exchanged glances. They're preparing to move against you directly, the marshal said. The legal approach isn't working fast enough, so they're planning something else. We need to get back to the cabin, Elias said. If they find it empty, they might destroy evidence or plant something incriminating. Or they might wait there for you to return, Hendricks countered. Walking into that situation could be exactly what they want. Then we go prepared, Elias said firmly. I know that country better than anyone. We have the advantage of terrain and knowledge. And if they're planning to force a confrontation, better to face it on ground we choose than wait for them to strike when we're vulnerable. Webb nodded slowly. The marshal is right, it's dangerous. But Elias has a point too. And strategically, we need to show strength. If we run or hide, we look guilty. If we stand our ground, we demonstrate confidence in our legal position. Margaret felt fear twist in her stomach, but she forced herself to speak calmly. When do we leave? Tomorrow at first light, Hendricks said. I'll come with you, along with 2 deputies I trust. We'll also bring Alice and John if they're willing. Having witnesses to whatever happens could be crucial. We're willing, Alice said immediately. John nodded agreement. Reverend Collins cleared his throat. I'd like to come as well, to testify if needed about the pressures I faced and the conversations I overheard. It's past time I made things right. That evening, they prepared for the journey. Hendricks arranged for weapons and supplies, including a spare rifle for Margaret. Elias spent an hour teaching her to load and fire it properly, and she was surprised by how steady her hands were. Fear had transformed into determination somewhere along the way. She found herself thinking about Samuel, imagining him working late into the night over his ledgers, planning his acquisitions, documenting the railroad's corruption. He must have known the danger he was courting. He must have understood that powerful men don't yield their advantages easily. Yet he'd persisted, driven by something deeper than mere profit, a belief that honest work and fair dealing mattered, that the law should protect the vulnerable rather than serve the powerful. That night, lying in her room at Mrs. Kaufman's boarding house, Margaret heard a soft knock on her door. She opened it to find Elias standing in the hallway, lamplight casting shadows across his weathered face. Couldn't sleep, he said quietly. Kept thinking about tomorrow and everything that could go wrong. Come in, she said, stepping back. He entered, leaving the door, respectfully open, and they sat together in the chairs by the window. Outside, Copper Ridge was settling into darkness, lamplight glowing in scattered windows. I need to tell you something, Elias said. In case things go badly tomorrow, I need you to know that marrying you was the best decision I've made in 20 years. You gave me purpose again. You reminded me that there are things worth fighting for. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. I was a burden no one wanted. You took me on out of kindness. No, I took you on because I saw something in you that reminded me of myself. Strength hiding behind resignation. And I was right, you're one of the strongest people I've ever known. He reached out and took her hand. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together, as partners, as equals. She leaned forward and kissed him gently, a brief touch that carried more weight than words. When she pulled back, she saw surprise and warmth in his eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for choosing me, for standing with me, for believing I was worth it. Always," he said simply. They sat together in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them, gathering strength for what was to come. Somewhere in the darkness, enemies were preparing to strike. But Margaret no longer felt like the helpless widow who'd stood in Black Hollow's town square. She felt like someone who'd found her purpose and her voice, someone who would fight for what was right no matter the cost. Tomorrow they would face whatever came, and they would face it together. Marshal Hendricks stepped out onto the porch, his badge catching the early morning light. His voice carried clearly across the clearing. "That's far enough, gentlemen. I'm United States Marshal Roy Hendricks, and you're trespassing on private property. State your business or turn around." Clayton Voss moved forward, flanked by armed men. Thomas Hale stayed slightly behind, his expensive clothes looking out of place in the Edane wilderness setting. "Marshal," Voss called out, "we're here on legal business. Thomas Hale has rightful claim to this property as Samuel Hale's brother and heir. These people," he gestured toward the cabin, "are occupying it illegally. That's a matter for the courts, not armed men in the woods before sunrise," Hendricks replied calmly. "And until a judge rules otherwise, Elias and Margaret Crow are the legal owners. You need to leave." "We have documents," Thomas Hale said, stepping forward with a leather case. "Signed by Judge Morrison in Black Hollow. They grant me immediate access to my brother's property, pending resolution of the inheritance dispute." Hendricks held out his hand. "I'll examine those documents." As Thomas approached the porch, Elias emerged from the cabin, rifle held casually but ready. Behind him, Margaret appeared, standing tall despite her fear. She saw the moment Thomas Hale recognized her, saw the calculation in his eyes as he assessed the situation. "Mrs. Crow," Thomas said with false warmth, "or should I say, Mrs. Crow II. I'm Samuel's brother. He spoke of you occasionally in his letters." "Samuel never mentioned a brother," Margaret said coldly. "Not once in 5 years of marriage." Something flickered across Thomas's face. "My brother and I had our differences, but blood is blood, and the law recognizes family bonds. These properties should rightfully pass to me as his closest living relative." "The properties passed legally to Margaret and then to me through our marriage," Elias said. "Your brother made his wishes clear. He wanted nothing to do with you." Hendricks finished examining the documents, his expression hardening. "These papers are worthless. Judge Morrison has no jurisdiction in Copper Ridge territory where the properties are registered. This is a transparent attempt to use false legal authority to seize property." Voss's pleasant facade cracked. "The Continental and Pacific Railroad has with a new mortars of that, invested millions in this territory. We won't allow a mountain hermit and his wife to obstruct progress because of some misguided sense of entitlement. Progress built on murder and corruption." A new voice called out. Everyone turned to see Daniel Price emerging from the trees on horseback, accompanied by 3 territorial rangers. He held up a sealed document case. "I have the test results from the chemist in Denver. The whiskey bottle from Samuel Hale's house contained arsenic in sufficient quantities to cause death when consumed over several days, and I have testimony from Mrs. Chen identifying the man who delivered it, a man she's prepared to identify in court." Price rode to the porch and dismounted, handing the documents to Hendricks. "I also have statements from 2 former Continental and Pacific employees who witnessed Voss ordering the forgery of the death certificate and payments to Dr. Winters to leave town. They're willing to testify in exchange for immunity from prosecution." Voss's face paled. "Those are lies, fabrications by disgruntled former employees." "Then you'll have the opportunity to defend yourself in court," Hendricks said. "Clayton Voss, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and corruption of public officials." He nodded to his deputies, who moved forward with restraints. The armed men Voss had brought shifted uncertainly. Without clear leadership and facing legal authority, their resolve wavered. Several backed away, clearly wanting no part of what was unfolding. Thomas Hale tried to retreat, but Elias blocked his path. "Not so fast. You knew about Samuel's murder, didn't you? That's why you waited exactly the right amount of time to file your claim. Long enough for the dust to settle, not so long that suspicion would fall on you." "I knew nothing," Thomas protested. "I only learned of my brother's death when Mr. Voss contacted me about the inheritance dispute." "Voss contacted you," Price said, making a note. "That's interesting, because according to Territorial Telegraph records, you sent the first telegram to Voss 3 days after Samuel died, before his death was even publicly announced. How did you know he was dead, Mr. Hale?" Thomas's face crumbled. "I want a lawyer. I'm not saying anything else without a lawyer present." "That's your right," Hendrik said. "You're also under arrest as an accessory. We'll sort out exactly what you knew and when in a proper courtroom." The confrontation deflated rapidly after that. The hired men dispersed, clearly wanting nothing to do with arrested principals. The deputies secured Voss and Thomas, preparing them for the journey back to Copper Ridge for formal charging. As the sun fully crested the mountains, Margaret stood on the porch beside Elias, watching justice finally catch up with the men who'd killed Samuel. She pulled out his pocket watch, running her thumb over the engraving. "Time reveals all truth," she read, softly. "Your husband was a wise man," Hendrik said, overhearing, "and patient. He built his case carefully, documented everything, made sure the truth would survive him, even if he didn't." Margaret felt tears on her cheeks, but they were different from the tears she'd cried in the months after Samuel's death. These were tears of resolution, of justice served, of a burden finally lifted. Elias's arm came around her shoulders, and she leaned into his solid presence. They'd won. Against corruption and violence and betrayal, they'd stood firm and won. The fight wasn't completely over. There would still be trials and legal proceedings. But the most important battle had been fought and decided here, in this clearing, as the sun rose over the mountains Samuel had loved. 3 months had passed since that dawn confrontation at the mountain cabin. Autumn had given way to early winter, and the first snows had dusted the high peaks. Margaret stood at the window of their new house, watching the sun set over the valley below, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The house was larger than the cabin, but still modest by the standards of their wealth. Built of solid timber with a wide porch and large windows, it sat on a gentle rise overlooking the property Samuel had acquired years ago. From here, she could see the beginnings of the mining operation that would employ 30 families by spring, the lumber mill that had already brought prosperity to the surrounding area, and the railroad siding, where honest negotiations with a competing company had resulted in fair terms for right-of-way access. Behind her, she heard Elias enter, boots heavy on the wooden floor. She turned and smiled at him, still sometimes surprised by the warmth that bloomed in her chest at the sight of him. He'd trimmed his hair and beard for the trial proceedings, but remained essentially himself, solid, steady, and honest. "Webb just left," he said, moving to stand beside her. "All the legal matters are finally settled." Thomas Hale's challenge was dismissed with prejudice. "The judge ruled that Samuel's will was clear and that our marriage was legal and proper in every respect." "And the criminal trials?" "Voss was sentenced to 20 years for conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. Thomas got 10 years as an accessory. Judge Morrison was removed from the bench and faces his own charges. Dr. Winters is cooperating with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence." Elias put his arm around her waist. "It's over, Margaret. Really over." She leaned against him, feeling the last tension drain from her shoulders. Samuel would be pleased. Justice served, his legacy protected, and the land being developed the way he envisioned. Speaking of development, we got 3 more applications today for the school fund. Teachers wanting to establish classrooms in the mining camps. Elias pulled a letter from his pocket, and this came from Harrison Webb. He's found 2 more instances of railroad companies using Voss's tactics. He wants to know if we'd support legal action to stop them. Margaret took the letter, scanning it quickly. What do you think? I think Samuel fought his whole life against that kind of corruption, and I think we're in a position to continue that fight. He paused. But it's your decision. This is Samuel's legacy as much as mine. She thought about the man she'd married out of practicality, the man who'd kept secrets to protect her, the man whose final gift had transformed her life in ways she never could have imagined. We support Webb's efforts. We use what Samuel built to make sure others don't suffer the way he did. Elias nodded, pride evident in his expression. I'll send word tomorrow. There was a knock at the door, and Alice Porter entered with a basket covered in cloth. I brought fresh bread and that apple butter you liked. John and the children are settling the horses. They're staying for supper, I hope. Of course, Margaret said warmly, embracing her friend. You're always welcome. The Porter family had become regular visitors, as had Reverend Collins, who'd found his conscience and his courage in the aftermath of the trials. He now preached about standing firm against corruption and protecting the vulnerable, sermons that resonated deeply with his congregation. Over supper, the conversation flowed easily. John talked about the lumber mill expansion. Alice shared gossip from Black Hollow. The town had undergone significant changes after Judge Morrison's removal, and the children played quietly near the fireplace. It was comfortable and warm, the kind of evening Margaret had never imagined she'd have when she stood in that town square 6 months ago, rejected and alone. After the Porters left, Margaret and Elias sat together on the porch despite the cold. Stars blazed overhead, bright and clear in the mountain air. Margaret pulled her shawl closer, the same worn black shawl she'd clutched during the selection ceremony. She'd kept it deliberately, a reminder of where she'd been and how far she'd come. I've been thinking about something, Elias said. That day in Black Hollow, when I stepped forward, I told you I did it because I knew what it felt like to be unwanted. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Margaret looked at him curiously. What was the rest of it? I'd been watching you before the ceremony started, saw you walking through town with your friend, saw the way you held yourself dignity in spite of everything, and I thought, there's a woman who hasn't given up. There's strength there. He took her hand. I didn't just choose you out of recognition or kindness, Margaret. I chose you because I saw something worth choosing. She felt tears gather but kept them back. I was nothing that day, a burden no one wanted. You were everything that day. You were brave and resilient and unbroken. You just couldn't see it yet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. I had this made in Copper Ridge. It's not fancy, but I wanted you to have it. Margaret opened the box and found a simple gold wedding band engraved with both their initials. Elias, the first ring was obligation and legal necessity, he said quietly. This one is choice. This one is love, if you'll accept it. She couldn't hold back the tears now. They slid down her cheeks as she held out her hand, letting him slip the ring onto her finger beside the plain band from their hasty ceremony. I accept it, and I love you too. I think I started loving you the moment you said those 3 words in the town square. They sat together as the stars wheeled overhead and the mountain night deepened around them. From unwanted widow to respected landowner, from solitary mountain man to husband and partner, they'd traveled an unexpected path. But it had led them here, to this porch, this view, this moment of perfect peace. What do you think Samuel would say if he could see all this? Margaret asked softly. Elias considered the question. I think he'd say that love and justice are worth fighting for, that honest work and fair dealing matter, and that the greatest wealth isn't measured in land or gold, but in dignity and partnership and the courage to stand firm when others would have you yield. Margaret smiled, squeezing his hand. I think you're right. Far below, Lights twinkled in the valley settlements where families lived and worked and built their futures on land that Samuel had secured through patient effort. His legacy wasn't just the fortune he'd left behind, but the proof that one person's integrity could make a lasting difference. And for Margaret, standing beside the man who'd chosen her when no one else would, who'd fought beside her and loved her and shown her that she'd always been worthy, Samuel's greatest gift wasn't the wealth or the land or the stock certificates. It was the chance to discover her own strength and find unexpected love in the process. The mountain man who'd lived with nothing had become the richest man alive, not through inheritance, but through the simple act of seeing value where others saw only burden. And the widow who'd lost everything had found a future brighter than any she'd imagined possible. Together, they'd taken Samuel's legacy and built something even he might not have envisioned: a life of purpose, love, and lasting meaning. And that, more than any fortune, was wealth beyond measure.